because by 1993, the Clinton administration had already decided internally, although it hadn't communicated this to the rest of the world, that NATO would expand in opposition to Russia's stated wishes. I mean, Ukraine has been in debt throughout its history, throughout its history of independence. The Trump administration is thinking about Ukraine, not as an ally, but as a financial asset. A lot of Ukrainian dissident websites and even some public figures, several of whom have been jailed,
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts to the link in the description box. But the least you can do is to like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome Professor Nicolai Petro. Professor Petro is a professor of political science at the University of Rhode Island in the United States. He also served as the U.S. State Department's Special Assistant for Policy on the Soviet Union under President George H.W. Bush. Professor Petro, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Nice to be with you again.
I want to hear your first response to the changing U.S.-Russia relationship. Over the weeks, President Trump and President Putin have had a long phone call followed by top national security of officials on both sides met in Saudi Arabia. And meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and retired General Kat Kellogg were sent to Kyiv to apparently pressurize Zelensky to make more concessions. How significant is this policy change in Washington?
It's a big deal. That's for sure. No one knows what was actually discussed. The leaks and reports are all selective and reflect the different spin that various actors, even people who weren't there, want to do it. Nevertheless, I think President Putin's press spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, put it very well when he said, we're finally not talking about war anymore, but talking about peace. And I think that's anyone with any sense of reality should welcome that development.
You said no one knows what's going on, but does anyone know what has led to this massive change in U.S. foreign policy towards Russia? Because it has been a long-standing policy that seems to be changing at this moment.
Well, I would have to attribute it to the will of the new president. Without getting into why, which again is pop psychology, it's clear that this is the intention of the president, who, and I always expected that if there was going to be a change, have to begin at the top, and specifically in the United States, that means the executive branch, because all the foreign policy levers in the United States are in the hands of the executive branch. So the executive branch has to decide the strategy, communicate that strategy to the rest of the government, then put people in charge of the various segments of government that will follow his orders in implementing them. So it takes a while, but over the course of the implementation of any policy, this one or any previous one, there has to be an insistence by the chief executive, the president, and his closest aides on communicating what the strategy will be. And in this case, it's been very clear, and has become, I should say, very clear, that the president actually does intend to try to change the nature U.S.-Russian relations from what they, for as long as we can remember, I would say, for as long as we can remember, except for maybe a very brief period of optimism on having Russia become a democracy between 1991 and no longer than 1993. Because by 1993, the Clinton administration had already decided internally, although it hadn't communicated this to the rest of the world, that NATO would expand in opposition to Russia's stated wishes, which meant that Russia was no longer considered a partner.
How significant do you think was the so-called mining agreements that Washington pushed for, and it is reported that Zelensky disagreed to sign because he thought it would lead to paying back far more than what he was paid by the United States. The numbers are like 500 billion versus 100 billion. And on the other side, on the Russian side, the release of Mark Fogel, mainstream media like the Financial Times are saying that when Trump came to power, the strategy was not as clear because he was also talking about reimposing sanctions on Russia. But these two events kind of abruptly changed the course of things. Do you think that's a healthy analysis, or is it like reading too much into small events?
I would say that we don't know from the outside what is a small event and what is a big event in the mind of the people who matter, and specifically the president. I think you're right, because I saw in the public domain the draft attributed to Keith Kellogg, the current emissary on Ukraine matters, which proposed multiple options for getting the two parties to the table. And they included increasing pressure on Russia, adding pressure on Ukraine, and withdrawing support to Ukraine or Russia, punishing essentially either party if they did not agree to this strategy. We don't know if there was any particular meeting or choice that would reflect a different point of view. But what we have seen being reflected in the public discourse is that the communications, as you say, that have begun between the American administration, the Russian administration, and the Ukrainian administration, leaving aside the Europeans for the moment, but just those three have resulted in having a more favorable, the Americans having a more favorable view of Russia. The Russian position, I would say, based on what the foreign minister of Russia has said, the Russian position now makes sense to the Americans. They find it comprehensible. whereas the Ukrainian position seems to them unrealistic. Like the Russians, like I said, they make sense, and what they want probably overall seems, judging from public statements, reasonable to the current the U.S. administration. On the other hand, what Zelensky is arguing is from a position where I believe the phrase that has come up is that Ukraine has no cards, or rather, Russia has all the cards, leaving Ukraine, I suppose, with very few cards. As a result, they should be coming to the table with greater eagerness because it has been communicated to them that they will be left on their own if they don't. So this puts the United States in a very advantageous position with respect to Ukraine, not with Russia, because Russia is more or less, I think, effectively insulated from the sanctions. Everything that has been done has already been done to change Russia's policy. I would suspect that the consensus in the Trump administration is that these policies have failed. So doing more of the same would just compound failure. On Ukraine, however, nothing has been done to date. At least that's how the Trump administration sees it. Money has been given to them without accountability, without results, without any expectations. And as a result, very harshly and undiplomatically, I would say, the Trump administration says that policy is not one we're going to pursue anymore, and we want our money back. So that's the undiplomatic part. No one expected for Ukraine to have to give back this money. But Trump says he wants it, and he's made this rather bizarre colonial proposal, which, as Zelensky says, would force Ukrainians to pay off this debt for the next 10 generations. So roughly 200 years, if we consider a generation being 20 years. Now, having said that, I would like to remind our readers, as I've written about in a number of venues and in my book, that paying off loans such as those that Ukraine has already incurred from the IMF, the World Bank, and primarily the European Union in support of its financial and economic needs, as well as military, although much of the military aid has been in grants, not all of it, but much of the economic assistance that has been provided from both public and private sources with the expectation of repayment. I mean, Ukraine has been in debt throughout its history, throughout its history of independence. And as was well known already, the debts incurred before 2021 already were an obligation to repay interest should the Ukrainian government, should the Ukrainian economy grow over 4%, the greater the growth rate, the more the repayment. And this repayment would in any case last for at least 40 years, putting a significant dampener on the prospects for economic growth. This was negotiated by the former prime minister before Shmyhal of Ukraine with the with financial backers of Ukraine. So this follows in that pattern, but it's just more egregious because it's a government policy rather than one negotiated by financiers. And it really tells you a lot about the way that the current Trump administration is thinking about Ukraine, not as an ally, but as a financial asset. And I don't mean political asset. I mean a financial asset that they see as losing value and they want to get rid of it without losing everything that they've invested in.
There are also private players. I read BlackRock, for instance,
Right.
lending a lot through the bond market in Ukraine. And at one point, they were saying that this money would be returned because the war might end. I, I mean, that was, I think, 4 months ago. But anyway, I wanted to ask you, Professor Petro, what do you think are the realistic options for Ukraine going forward? You've spoken about kind of return of diplomacy when it comes to U.S.-Russia relationship. What should be Ukraine's position now in terms of territory? Some people are saying that the Donbas region is gone. There might be some more bargain over Odessa or Kharkiv. Some say that they're owned by. What is left of Ukraine, and what is the most viable, practical, pragmatic approach that Ukraine should take, in your opinion?
If the conventional assessment today, the military assessment, the economic assessment of Ukraine, the demographic assessment, the lack of manpower and resources, if those are, as the Trump administration and most independent analysts agree on this picture of Ukraine, then the picture is very dire. And it's easy to see why several analysts who in the past have been more hopeful about Ukraine and urged it to fight on in the hopes of being able to limit Russia's incursion and force it to the negotiating table. This prospect now seems totally unrealistic. Hence, if Ukraine is destined to lose sooner or later, then logically, from the Ukrainian government's perspective, you should want that loss to end sooner so that you can rebuild with greater resources. Because continuing the battle will only lead to greater territorial losses. Perhaps at some point, it seems likely even, the collapse of the Ukrainian military, at which point Russia will have far fewer incentives to make any concessions to Ukraine. So it seems to me the logical stance, the best stance for Ukraine right now, given the realities on the ground, is to, with the help of its allies, to concede, to essentially come to the table and bargain for the best outcome of these negotiations that it can, but with the reality, but that has to be acknowledging the reality that Ukraine has lost, because I think that is the reality. They can pretend and they can issue rhetoric and not tell their own populations, because there's essentially an effective media blackout in Ukraine. But that is the reality, and any serious analyst, I think, can only make proposals based on that reality.
What you just said is that it's a so you gave us the realistic way forward. I just wanted to ask, given a lot of people discusses that the Russian speaking areas in Ukraine or formerly whatever, they have overwhelming support for the Russians now. There is a much more popular
Right.
wave. Is that true? I just wanted to check with you.
We cannot rely on the accuracy, or we should not rely on the accuracy of any surveys done in Ukraine, in the regions under government control or in the regions under occupation. Because for two reasons. One, each government filters those results as best it can to make its case, to make whatever case it wants politically. Secondly, and just as importantly, as every social scientist will tell you, you cannot get accurate readings of attitudes under stress. And war is a stressful situation. If you remove that stress, then you would probably get a very different result. So what I'm saying is, when you're being bombarded, lights are going out, it's a stressful situation, you can't even talk to your relatives. That's one situation. A year from now, when if let's say that ended next month, a year from now, when some of these things have, and normalcy has to some extent been restored, you would get a very different attitude by the same people. So the people who say today, I would never speak Russian, or I would never speak Ukrainian, or I will never forgive, or I will never do whatever. A month, well, not a month, but a year or 2 or 5 down the road are likely to have a different attitude. And much has to do not just with the individuals themselves and the circumstances they're in. Generational changes also have a big role to play. So whereas I can well believe, because I've experienced it in my own youth in Europe, that people of an older generation had an instinctive hatred for Germans in the sort of neighboring countries. Germans, anything German, because they were the invaders, they did this to us. The children already kind of said, oh, we're not into that sort of hatred. And the grandchildren say, what are you talking about, granddad? I like Helga. We're going out, we're going to the movies together. Why are you giving me grief about dating a German girl in Holland, for example? So that is inevitable. That is going to come to pass, especially among populations that are so intermixed. And so whatever we have today, and I can easily understand that there is much anger and much hatred that has been fomented in order to prosecute the war, in order to both defend the country successfully and to attack the country successfully. That will go away slowly if governments become involved in trying to actually mend fences and improve relations. It will go a little bit. It'll go a little bit faster. But there's a famous monument in Poltava, the site of a famous battle where Peter the Great beat the king of Sweden and his Ukrainian allies. And there's a monument there to that battle, which says in 3 languages, Swedish, Ukrainian, and Russian, time heals all wounds. Truer words were never spoken.
I want to ask you your response to Trump's calling Zelensky a dictator, not because I generally lose sleep over these labels because they are just so meaningless sometimes, but in this case, I wanted to ask you because it's such a polarizing issue. Some, of course, the pro-Ukrainian Western press would call Zelensky he's fighting for freedom and liberation and whatnot, liberal democracy, and the other side would say that he is a fascist and he's a literal descendant of Nazis, which I don't understand given he's a Jew. But
You're saying there are
this
no Jewish Nazis?
um
There's been everything under the
okay.
sun.
Yeah. So, given you are someone, you're a scholar on this, I want to hear from you your response about Trump calling Zelensky a dictator, and through that response, if you can give us a little bit about the wrong policies and the problems in Ukraine as it stood even before the Russian invasion.
I think what Trump does is to try to exacerbate the situation, relations with people that he wants to put at a disadvantage in public. He'll do that to everybody, senators, mayors in his own country, foreign leaders. The debate here, and I guess elsewhere, is, does he know what he's saying? Does he take cognizance of the implications? Does he care? Who knows? That's what he does. And just as easily, you will see that, like when he calls one president of Latin America, a criminal supporting, gangs. As soon as he does what Trump asks, he's potentially our best friend. We're looking forward to building relations, etc. And this can happen in 24 to 48 hours. So I don't worry about what Trump is thinking. He has this strategy, and I think he feels that it is a successful strategy because it upsets opponents. It doesn't allow them to get all of their arguments in a row to contradict him. They are off worrying about why was I called a dictator, or why was I called a bad guy, or why this, instead of focusing on the important issues that Trump is trying to push through. And he feels he can get around their opposition by making them look foolish in this way. It's worked. It's worked often enough that he will continue to do that. But your question, there's a flip side to your question, is how true is it that Zelensky is a dictator? Well, for that, I always say to my students, define your terms. What are we talking about? What do you think a dictator is? Okay, well, this is what I think a dictator is. There is no universal term, no universal definition that everyone will accept. On Democrat, dictator, left, right, capitalist, socialist, all these terms are fungible. If you see Zelensky as a figure under tremendous pressure who is against incredible odds defending his country, then none of this matters. It doesn't matter if he's a dictator. It will simply be dismissed, as it is on that side, as Russian propaganda, and I won't even, then it doesn't even need to be addressed. On the other hand, if you either are worried about the way the war is being conducted and want to diminish Zelensky's power, the power that he's gradually accumulated to himself as commander-in-chief, and the phrase in the Ukrainian constitution as guarantor of the constitution, an awesome power to do anything he wants as guarantor of the constitution, then you would begin, as a lot of Ukrainian dissident websites and even some public figures, several of whom have been jailed. I would most note Alexander Dubinsky, who has been in jail, I think, for more than a year now, for challenging the authority of President Zelensky. Even though he's a member of parliament in Zelensky's own party, a lot of people are accused of treason, including the former president, by the way, Poroshenko, who, while he was at the Munich Security Conference defending Ukraine, he was also being indicted for corruption and possible treason, put under sanctions by the security and defense body of Ukraine. And there have been notable tensions also with the mayor of Kiev, between Zelensky's administration and the mayor of Kiev. So all of this is part of the package. The crux of the argument that Trump has raised rests on the notion that Zelensky's term in office has expired and he has refused to hold elections as mandated under the Constitution. This is true. This is true. However, on the flip side of this legal argument, Zelensky argues that the government and the Rada have supported the prolongation of martial law. And the courts have upheld the interpretation, which is not in the Constitution, but they have upheld this interpretation that under martial law, the government should not hold elections. Well, this is new. I mean, this again is not in the Constitution. So this happens often enough in Ukraine that nobody is terribly upset by the fact that the courts and the politicians are acting in ways that does not conform to the letter of the Constitution. So you can see how legal scholars outside of this political debate can argue and see both sides of this argument. You can make the case, or you can say there is justification for not holding elections. Has Zelensky abused his authority in other areas, shutting down media, shutting down the canonical church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and jailing dissidents, including members of the political opposition? Yes, there is evidence of all those. Does it rise to the level of challenging the authority of the president who during a war? I don't know. That's for the Ukrainian people to decide, not for me, certainly. Having said that, the challenge for Zelensky is to essentially try to bring back the country to a normal state of political life after the war, should he still be in power. And that will be very difficult to do, given the sanctions that he has imposed, which began to be imposed not after the war began, but in 2021, early in 2021, against people that he deemed his political opponents, and that have, in the aftermath of that, have fled to various countries, including Russia.
This is my second last question. So my last question, I want to ask you about Europe and its implication, but and so answer this as concisely or as extensively, depending on your time. Um, can you tell us a little bit about pushing along what you were just saying, the political coalition that Zelensky had, because the right sector is talked about a lot. So, how significant is the right sector for Zelensky to be in power? How big the right sector itself is in Ukrainian politics, and if there are alternatives to the right sector, whether it's liberals or left or whatever, how strong are they? And in the event of a collapse of Zelensky regime under different pressures, can those alternatives emerge out of that?
So Zelensky, in the framework of the constitutional institutions, the Rada, so it's a unicameral legislature, and the courts, has no need for allies because he has no opposition. What we have had since his election is what is called in Ukrainian a unitary majority. He has the absolute majority of seats. His party has the absolute majority of seats. And the Rada, when voting, is essentially a rubber stamp. And the courts have also been brought to heel since Zelensky has systematically replaced all of the constitutional court judges and created alternative supervisory institutions to look into things like corruption and management and this and that. And those are largely sponsored by Western governments and funded by Western governments, which are allied to Zelensky. A double-edged sword, though, as we now see, because of the cuts and the stance taken by the Trump administration. So that's with respect to the constitutional framework and the relationship of the presidency to it. The right, the far right in Ukraine is outside of that framework. It has existed as a series of organizations under many different names, many different umbrellas. But the best way to think of this group as a whole is to say these are extreme nationalists who, not trusting, since 1991 up to the present, not trusting the willingness of Ukrainian political and economic elites to really cut ties with Russia and turn inward and rely on Ukrainian populism, which is most strongly represented culturally and religiously in the four Western regions of Ukraine, not the Eastern Ukrainian, not Eastern Ukraine and the center. But to rely only on those, they have supported paramilitary training and organizations. In the past, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, these paramilitary organizations were, the government has tried to rein them in. Its leaders have been brought have been charged with insurrection at times. But after 2014, the loss of Crimea, the rebellion in Donbass, a lot of politicians have said, well, we have now come to power as a result of the Maidan, which is a popular uprising, which was supported with military strength of the only group that proved loyal to the Maidan. The military did not. The military in Crimea, 80% of it crossed over to the Russians. And in the East, we saw the same thing. And the official Ukrainian military, which remained loyal to Kiev, refused to shoot at them because it would have started a civil war, and that was impossible, an impossible choice for the Ukrainian military at the time. So the only basis in force that the government had in 2014, the Maidan government, which came to power as a result of a coup and replaced the legitimate president, Viktor Yanukovych, was these paramilitary groups. That brought them into the government. That gave them the connections and the influence needed to begin to condition the official armed forces, to begin to insist on the replacement of commanders, to take over key positions in the internal security forces. And again, none of this reflects political parties. None of this reflects political influence, but it reflects the real basis of who controls military force and has guns and weapons in Ukraine. So that's where we are today. We have a military in Ukraine which has been fighting, sometimes very well, but increasingly under dire circumstances, which is having difficulty recruiting people. Many young people especially don't want to fight. On the other hand, we have volunteers who have been there since the beginning, were trained and are good soldiers based on the 8-year-long war that they had with Russia, as they felt it, 2014 to 2022, and they have the military experience, and they are the frontline troops. When the war ends, what will their role be? A very difficult question for them, because on the one hand, they're at the peak of their actual power to influence politics. If politics begins to shift from a militarized society to a civilian society, they lose everything. They have no more influence because their political appeal is untested as yet. Maybe this commander, maybe that commander will be popular, but will they be popular everywhere in the country? Hard to say. Will they be popular by more than the people around their troops? A lot of bad press, anyway, it could go a lot of different ways. I suppose that, if you have the guns in your hands, I could see a very strong argument being made by the current military leadership of the far-right groups that are loosely integrated, and I stress the word, loosely integrated into the current Ukrainian armed forces. There would be every incentive for them to hold on to those weapons, to act, and they have argued this publicly before, as the additional guarantee that the government will not betray the interests of Ukraine after the war as they interpret them. Not as any elected officials will interpret them, but as they will interpret them.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as you were speaking, I can't help but think Nazi Germany, where there was such a sophisticated relationship between the SS troopers and the German army, initially beginning with a lot of antagonism, but later on there was a loose integration of the troopers into the army. I don't want to put words in your mouth.
We go too easily to the one analogy that people remember. But what they don't remember is that Nazi Germany was not unique throughout Europe in the 1930s, and that there were Nazi paramilitary rallies in places like Chicago, in places like New York in the United States. We don't like to think about those examples because they didn't get very far, and then, we engaged in a military confrontation. But in countries, some of which remained neutral, like Spain, like Portugal, others that became allies with Hitler and that the United States also declared war on, namely Romania and Hungary, not to mention in Asia, Japan, the situation that you just described was very similar because it's a logical way for these relations to evolve.
Yeah, and I must say, like that has happened also in places where revolutions happened, and the communist militias and left militias have
Exactly.
always worked in tandem with the regular military in fighting their own wars. Um, I want to end by asking you, what is the implication of the shift in Washington vis-a-vis Russia in Europe, as we see Pete Hegseth has openly said that the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO is like very, very unlikely, while J.D. Vance goes on lectures the Europeans about democracy, about free speech and whatnot, and Trump is consistently saying that that Europe has to do more in terms of its own security, or if at all they want to be in NATO. Europe is very divided on the issue of Russia, and in Germany in particular, the most important, I think, country vis-a-vis the issue, and vis-a-vis Europe, we are also seeing the conservatives now coming, although AfD has also become the largest opposition, who is to a great extent pro-Russian. What is the implication on Europe in all this?
Um, it will be very difficult for Europe to play any meaningful role in the negotiations. I think of it largely in monetary or financial terms. Let's say, being conservative, that all the assistance given by the West, which has kept Ukraine afloat, not only militarily, but as a society, economically, its government functions are underwritten by Western financial assistance, and including loans, grants and loans. If, to say conservatively, 40% of that comes from the United States, the withdrawal of that means that more or less the countries that are currently supporting this effort in Europe would have to increase their commitment by a substantial amount to make up the difference. Otherwise, they're essentially failing in their commitment. And indeed, they have promised to do at least as much or more, because that is the logic of the policy that they're demanding. They want Ukraine to go on the offensive, to be strong, to win. This will require not significantly less money, but significantly more money. And then add on to that, we have the stated commitment urged by NATO to double the percentage of GDP from 2 across the board to 5. Well, more than double. So to 5% across the board. So again, an extraordinary amount of funding. As I look at the European landscape, the elections that we've seen, that we're going to be seeing in the near future in Romania, perhaps other Western European countries, like I would say France and Britain, not to mention the shifting political landscape in Italy as well, where parts of the members of the current Italian government coalition have been silenced and forced to take a pro-NATO stance in the past, but have always been historically uncomfortable with that position and more leaning toward Russia. So that could lead to some interesting trends. If all of that happens, the current governments in Europe are essentially trying to win elections with policies that have failed and asking for enormously more money to do the same thing. They will fail. All you have to do is add up these numbers and say, what in the world are you asking us to do? There's no way you can even fund the current request, not to mention the future, without hurting our economy, our economies. Germany's economy has been in depression for 2 years. This can't possibly help. This will only make matters worse. And I think this is what is leading to the shift in the political shift away from the current governments. And if we see that continue, then I think those analysts who have argued that Trump, who is currently, let's say, for sake of argument, alone in his view that Ukraine has to come to terms because it can no longer be supported by the West, because the United States is withdrawing its support. That will be commonly understood throughout Europe, for some more likely in the West, by people saying, yes, we want the good old days back when we got cheap energy from Russia. Let's rebuild our ties. Much more reluctantly in the Baltic states and in Poland, who will grumblingly and reluctantly go along with this because they have no choice. And so Trump will wind up with essentially many more allies in, I think, the not too distant future, 1 or 2 years in Europe, than we see today. And then it won't be a matter of Europe versus the United States. It will be much more a divided Europe. And the more Europe becomes divided internally, again, the less likely it is to act in a unified manner in support of Ukraine or against the United States on any level, economic, political, or military.
Professor Petro, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.